Thank you all and for the invitation to join this ECPR online seminar on organized crime. On the topic that everyone will discuss today, I'm the first one to present, so the challenge of being the first one is like, what are the common questions that we have for thought and for discussion on this panel? So I was reflecting on the title of the panel, and the first thing that comes is, what do we understand by trends in organized crime, and what are those trends? So these are some questions that made me reflect how also can we identify and analyze them. I think that when we discuss trends, we are also bringing the notion of what kind of narrative these trends talk to us and reflect the reality that we live in. These are also an explanation of how we collect and how we analyze those data and the narrative that is associated with it. I bring this idea of narrative because I will bring the case of Costa Rica, and it is common in some of the countries in Central America to hear one important aspect that reflects the dynamic of organized crime in this country, that is related to being a transit country for the illicit. And I think that this kind of narrative threatens some of the policies that the government should adopt in combating and countering organized crime. And when I mention this, it's because some of the data that I recently collected in the case of Costa Rica reflects a way of confronting the narrative that is being told by the government, and also in a way that we can understand critically this situation that Costa Rica is nowadays facing. So the first thing is to bring the notion, the aspect that the criminality score of Costa Rica increased 0.55 points based on the Global Organized Crime Index. But one element and one data that I collected recently refers to the quantity of dismantled criminal groups throughout one decade. So if we see in this graph, we have from 2012 to 2023, a total of 1,858 criminal groups that were dismantled throughout these 11 years in the country. So they are fragmented in narco family, local criminal groups, and international. And then when we go see a fragmented perspective of each of these criminal groups, we have a variation of how this dynamic also explains to us the increased rate of violence that Costa Rica is nowadays facing. So we have, as narco families, from 2012, until 2023, a huge amount of narco families that are being dismantled, but at the same time, these also reflect us more challenges in a sense that they are being dismantled, but at the same time, the level of criminality does not diminish, which also reflects some years that this quantity also increases. And also, it relates to the quantity of local criminal groups that are being dismantled in the country. So from 2012, that was more than 140 groups, local groups, criminal groups that were dismantled. In 2023, we have more than 120. So we have almost no variation, or just in short diminishing from this total period. And from the international criminal groups, we have 1 year that was the peak of the dismantled groups, that was in 2015, but then we also have a combination and a variation of how these dismantled groups increases and diminishes throughout these years. So based on this, it is important to understand that how a country with more than 5 million people, inhabitants, have such a huge amount of criminal gangs being dismantled throughout one decade, which reflects this in a very common sense. It's like one criminal group for 20,000 inhabitants, which reflects not only this kind of dynamic, but also a new way of understanding the geography of organized crime in Central America through this Costa Rican case. And then in a comparative analysis of all these criminal groups that are being dismantled throughout this decade that was analyzed, the local groups are the groups that are more prevalent throughout this period of analysis in comparison to the narco families and also international. But the point here is not to analyze those groups being dismantled in separate, but also to think critically on how they are connected in their specific dynamics that it's not contemplated by these analysis at this moment. So thank you very much, Fausto. I stop here and I will continue with the next part.
Thank you, Mauricio. Well, indeed, a very insightful approach of Costa Rica as a case study. Actually, I was wondering, but not for now, but if you find certain commonalities in other case studies in the region. So, but just a random question for now. So now it's turn of Victoria. I will proceed to read her bio. So Victoria Bird Ruiz-Benítez de Lugo is a conflict and stabilization advisor in the UK's Office for Conflict, Stabilization and Mediation in the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Victoria recently delivered a cross-government conflict analysis for the British Embassy in Bogotá, and previously worked as an advisor tackling serious and organized crime in Latin America with a specific focus on Colombia. So with no further ado, please, Victoria, thanks again.
Thanks very much, Fausto, and thanks to everyone online. It's a huge honor to have been invited to speak amongst such esteemed panelists. So yeah, many thanks. I'm conscious that in the kind of the blurb for this webinar, there's a kind of quite a heavy emphasis on research. And frankly, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on research when I'm surrounded by academics and real specialists of this nature. So the perspective that I can really shed over the next 8 minutes is largely one of a practitioner and largely one of a kind of civil servant and a diplomat who's worked for a kind of international partner in the Latin American context. So I think there are kind of, I'll speak of a few principles that I think we consistently adopted and some of the challenges that I found in my work. You know, over the course of my career, I've kind of advised on policy for the UK in terms of how we better tackle kind of transnational and serious organized crime, but also how we design programmatic interventions in these different contexts across Latin America. For example, kind of a more preventative focused program looking at the context in Ecuador, as well as work in Colombia. And obviously, given that quite big emphasis that I've had in the Colombian context, I'll draw quite a lot on that. And therefore, one of the key thematic areas of interest for me is that serious organized crime, conflict and instability nexus. And I think it's a kind of a really, really interesting space to consider, because I think there are lots of lessons we need to better apply and leverage from that kind of conflict, peacekeeping, peace building community into the context of transnational organized crime. And obviously the relationship between transnational organized crime, instability and violence in the Latin American context is one that's been kind of widely researched and discussed. And no doubt the rest of our panelists will kind of touch on their work in this matter. I think one of the things that I feel we have to think about really carefully is around that kind of non-linear relationship between instability and serious organized crime, and the complexities that actually at times criminal governance structures can generate more peaceful, less violent conditions, and at other times they don't. They kind of generate widespread violence, as we've seen in, you know, the context of Ecuador most recently and most dramatically. And I think being really clear around the analysis and the actor mapping to really try and understand when we design these interventions, when we advise kind of on law enforcement responses or on kind of developmental, more humanitarian driven responses, like what are these governance structures, what do they do, and what's their role in kind of service delivery, what's the level of legitimacy that they have with the populations and communities they are operating alongside, for, within. And I think linked to that, the second key reflection I'd like to highlight in my intervention is really around kind of breaking down silos when you're working as a practitioner. So I've spoken a bit around the kind of the conflict community and set of practitioners versus the kind of law enforcement, serious organized crime versus the development practitioners, and how we all need to kind of work together and operate in very similar spaces. But I guess on a more operational, practical level, which is the level I can really speak to more, it's in how in my experience, you as someone who's trying to deliver and design these types of interventions can break down silos and start to speak the same language as different communities in government and in other governments and in civil societies in these areas. So one of the trends we're seeing, no doubt we'll discuss it more around, for example, increases in kind of diversification of organized criminal groups and their investments, and the increase in environmental crime and the impact that has on environmental degradation as well as instability. From a government perspective, from an international donor perspective, how can we work with our colleagues who work on climate, who work on environment, but who also work on defense and conflict and peace building? How can we try and knit this fabric of practitioners together and build in the lessons that colleagues on the panel and others online, no doubt, will have found in research, and build it into practical kind of realistic solutions? And I think there are a few principles that we need to abide by. One is kind of conflict sensitivity analysis across the board, this sense of really trying to think through our unintended consequences and the potential harms we are causing by acting, by doing anything. And I think the way that we do that isn't necessarily by waving the kind of slightly academic flag of conflict sensitivity analysis. It's trying to help other parts of governments and other communities and other practitioners think through some of these problems in really practical terms, and emphasize the ways in which this will help them think through and meet their own objectives. And the final point, I guess, is one of realism and pragmatism, and at times one of discomfort, right? Because these objectives aren't always complementary and do sometimes clash. And I think being clear on where the tensions are when we're trying to design and affect change, and being really honest about that as kind of international communities working with host governments in Latin America, will be a really important part of the process, and a really important integral aspect of how we go about tackling these problems in a kind of in the least harmful, most peaceful way possible. So yeah, I will pause there, and obviously very happy to kind of, and looking forward to continuing the discussion with colleagues.
Thanks, Victoria. Very, very interesting, your first intervention, and I will, among other things, I stay with this idea of breaking down the epistemological silos, not only between, like, whether you're a practitioner or researcher or scholar or public servant, but also from government to government, which is quite challenging. And well, it's a challenge we need to address, because it's basically the adaptation gap we need to make in order to adapt to the risks and challenges that the transnational organized crime poses in the region. So thank you very much for your first intervention. So Cecilia, it would be now turn of Dr. Cecilia. I will proceed to read the bio. Dr. Cecilia Farfán is a researcher with the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at UC San Diego, and the Center for Studies on Security, Intelligence and Governance, CSIG, at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. Dr. Farfan is an expert on organized crime, US-Mexico security cooperation, and gender mainstreaming. Dr. Farfan has consulted for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the Organization of American States, the United States Institute for Peace, USAID, and regularly guest lectures at the US Foreign Service Institute. Dr. Farfan is a member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Urban Violence Research Network, and the Strategy Committee for the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development. Also, Dr. Farfan received her doctorate in political science from UC Santa Barbara, her master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs, and her bachelor's in international relations from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. She has been a recipient of several research fellowships, including the Fulbright Program and Mexico's National Council on Science and Technology. Dr. Farfan Mendez, over to you.
Thank you, Fausto, and of course, thank you to ECPR and the Standing Group on Organized Crime for this invitation. I'm sure I also have to thank whoever invited Lucia to that high-level meeting. So, thank you to them as well, so I could join this conversation with colleagues I, of course, admire as well. So let me share with you 3 points. And this reflection is based on my recent visit to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It's the annual, basically high-level event on drug policy of the United Nations. And so let me tell you a little bit about what happened in that high-level event and how the states live their best lives there and how this relates to Latin America and where I see trends going. So one of the interesting things that happened at the CND this year is that Secretary Blinken attended. And this is the first time ever that the US Secretary of State attends the most important, again, event on drug policy that is held by member states. And what was interesting about Secretary Blinken's speech at the CND is that it really was a message about multilateralism. It was an appeal to the world to think about synthetic drugs. And I mean, certainly there's some language there that is still very similar to, the war on drugs language, but it really moved away from the certification days, from the, the good guys who are the consumer guys who are always being attacked, and damaged by the, production countries. It really moved away from that. And it was a call to global action, if you will, in that speech. And what this means for Latin America, and I think to Mauricio and Victoria's points, is that it really should mean that Latin America needs to walk away from this mentality when it comes to drug trafficking about production, transit, and consumer countries, right? Like these neat separate categories that have existed before in discussions, in academic discussions, but also policy discussions around drug trafficking, don't really represent the reality anymore. And this is an opportunity, to take these words, by the US that has led, as we know, many policies, some very unsuccessful ones in the region in drug policy and shift the conversation. And I would argue that this is very obvious at border regions, and in particular, the US-Mexico border region, where we know consumption of fentanyl, for instance, is also happening. So it's not only that it is produced in Mexico, but at the border, we really see all these points converging. And so what this means, and to Victoria's point, I think we should also be thinking, again, move away from these separate categories, but have better information about users. This is something that the region really lags behind in terms of just having information about drug use, but also environmental impacts of drug production. And I think this is a very relevant question, especially as synthetics become more important in the conversation and there's more demand for them. We see, when it comes to cocaine, we certainly see the impacts on that, on deforestation in the Amazon, but synthetics also are polluting waterways and water resources in a way that should be in the conversation, in my opinion, when it comes to drugs. The other point that I would make that also happened at the CND has to do with firearms. And this is, I think in Latin America in particular, it is very obvious to us that firearms are connected to organized crime, right? But it's just now that these connections are being stated at the international level in instruments that have these. And now, very quickly, let me just share some data. So the most recent study on global homicide from the UN tells us that globally, there's 5.8 homicides per 100,000 people. Now, for the Americas, which is a region that has the highest level of homicides, this is 15 per 100,000. And according to this study, 67% of homicides that happen in the region are perpetrated with a firearm. And they estimate that around 50% of all homicides that happen in the Americas have to do with organized crime or gang activity. Now, I would argue that comparatively, what we know in terms of research about firearms trafficking and ammunition in the region is very low. Given the numbers of how much firearms are involved in this lethal form of violence, I don't think we have an equal body of research. Certainly, we have some very important ones that have been produced by civil society organizations. I'm not saying there's nothing. What I'm saying is that I think we could have a lot more information on this. And I would make the case that similar to drug markets, firearms trafficking markets are also incredibly regional. And so even within the Americas, we would find important differences as to how this trafficking happens. And I think, again, building on Victoria's point, it also tells us about the different types of violence and crimes that we see in the region, right? So an organization that is involved in extortion, for instance, or running a protection racket will use these firearms in a different way than organizations that perhaps are involved in drug trafficking, just because the way that they need to use violence and perpetrate it is differently. So if there's someone out there looking for an interesting research project, I would certainly push that we need a lot more information on firearms, but also ammunition. And so, that's something that I think, again, we should pay attention to. And just to close this first round of comments, and certainly not least, I would say gender is still very much a big gap when it comes to understanding organized crime in Latin America. And certainly, again, I think there is increasingly more work in this area. At the CND, gender seems to be an afterthought still, something like, oh, well, we should add that to appease certain groups, rather as understood as an essential component for really understanding organized crime holistically. And so, one of the reasons that it's very important to look at gender is because I think we have an emphasis on violence, and not to, undermine my previous point on firearms, but I think there's a lot of functions around organized crime that are non-violent, that are essential for sustaining organized criminal activities that are often performed by women. And so this is, a call to also understand really organized crime, like the entire phenomenon holistically, by also paying attention to gender. But it also means really looking at the composition of criminal justice systems in Latin America. I mean, globally, criminal justice systems are mostly occupied by men, but it should also tell us something about why we're not able to reduce levels of violence and really tackle some of these challenges, because we're not also understanding what our criminal justice systems look like. And finally, the question of gender also has to do with the differential impacts that organized crime has in the region. So it's not the same, they're not the same challenges in urban and rural spaces. And I think also by looking at gender, it really opens up that box of like, okay, where exactly in the region are we talking about this? So 3 very quick comments again, this moving away from these categories of production, transit, consumer, country, looking more at firearms, and certainly looking more at gender. And I'll stop there for this first round. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thanks for sharing your experience at the CND, the most recent one. So now it will be the turn of Chris. And Chris, let me read your bio. Chris Dalby is founding director of World of Crime, a consultancy based in the Netherlands that brings a solutions-focused approach to the study of transnational organized crime. He's the author of the World of Crime Guide to the Jalisco Cartel New Generation, to be published in April 2024. Chris has previously served as the managing editor of Inside Crime, the leading think tank, for 5 years. He was also foreign correspondent in Mexico, Brazil, China, and Malaysia. So with this, Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fausto. And thank you to all the other panelists who actually, every single one of them touched on a point that I want to make today. So thank you for making my intro a little bit easier. What I want to focus on is the way that European institutions are very, very keen to invest and contribute more to the fight against organized crime in Latin America, but are absolutely frozen about the best way to do it. To Victoria's point, I think there are a lot of gaps in the understanding, especially the up-to-date understanding of Latin American organized crime trends in European institutions. I mean more on the Brussels side, not so much on the UK. To Cecilia's point, there is a feeling that we are all in this together. The presence of Anthony Blinken at the CND was notable, and I think there's a feeling that we're all in this together at a time when the US really needs a win in Latin America. Mm. The problem is the EU doesn't know who to partner with and doesn't know what to invest in. There's a lack of centralized agreement in the EU about the best way to tackle Latin American organized crime challenges and the way they affect the bloc. Let's take port security as the main one, right? We are always hearing about the amount of cocaine flooding out of Ecuador and Brazil and Colombia into Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and then onto the rest of Europe. I work a lot with the port administrations, and the lack of up-to-date knowledge of the ways in which cocaine is smuggled and other drugs are smuggled is shocking, to be honest. I blame that partially on a lack of centralized leadership in the EU, which has left city mayors. Interestingly, city mayors are the ones at the European level who seem to be pushing drug policy, even though it's not their job to set it. In January, the mayors of Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg, which are the three main entry points into the EU, visited Ecuador, Costa Rica, Colombia, and I think Peru as well, especially with ports. They went there more as a political exercise than to really make partnerships. This certainly is what came back to Europe. They were making statements saying that Belgian and Dutch cops should be sent to Ecuador, for example, to help them hunt down drug kingpins in the same way that the US helped to hunt down Escobar in '93. It's a level of rhetoric that the EU is just not really familiar with. We're still obsessed with cocaine in the EU, and we should be, but there's a lack of focus on other trends that really affect the bloc. For example, Inside Crime recently published an amazing investigation on fentanyl precursors around the world, and in that report, Germany was central to the way that the Jalisco cartel and Sinaloa cartel get certain precursors, especially since China has been cracking down. So Europe is not just on the demand side of the drug crisis, right? It is also at a smaller level, but an important level, a contributor to the demand side economics of drug trafficking. And I think that's receiving not much attention. I wasn't at the CND, so if this was talked about in Vienna, I do apologize. And then the final point I want to talk about is there is a real concern that even when you find countries, let's say Costa Rica, Uruguay, Argentina, countries that have a strong institutional reputation, or at least a stronger institutional reputation, there's a lack of continuity in security policy. There is a growing concern, and I'm being deliberately vague because obviously this is conversations I've been having with diplomats in Brussels, that anti-narcotics or anti-organized crime policies in Latin America, and this is in Mexico, Ecuador, Uruguay, Chile, are intimately tied to whoever is in power. Ecuador is the prime example of this. Noboa has made a lot of political gains on the back of his Plan Phoenix, but nobody has actually seen Plan Phoenix written down. The referendum last weekend gave us a much better idea of how that plan is going to move forward. But again, he's up for re-election next year. it looks likely that he will win with very high approval ratings based on the success, and I put that in major quotation marks, for security policy. But again, when I talk to European diplomats, is to what extent is Plan Phoenix Plan Noboa? To what extent is Paz Total in Colombia Plan Petro? And when you're asking international partners like the US, like the EU, to invest billions of dollars in specific programs, that uncertainty is a big roadblock. And I'm not entirely sure of how that can be fixed. I think we need to see, or at least EU countries need to see, a level of continuity in the debate in certain countries. That can happen. I imagine in Ecuador, for example, the popularity of Plan Phoenix or the security crackdown means that essentially anyone who wants to be presidential next year is going to have to back it. Costa Rica is an example in another way. Even with the current administration being a little bit more gung-ho, there is a sort of continuity about a more pacific approach to organized crime. And I think that's what the EU wants to see. More Costa Rica level continuity and less Ecuador level peaks and valleys. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Well, the lack of up-to-date knowledge on illicit flows, particularly cocaine, that was a highlight for me. And this is tied to something very important, which is some evidence-based public policies. Sometimes we need to, well, many times is disregarded, and we're basically based on political decisions instead of evidence-based public policies. And also the lack of continuity. I think this is particularly the case of Mexico, I would argue, in terms of security policies, whether they're drug policies or criminal policies, or even in the institutional design, who is going to fight or counter the organized crime. This might also be a trend in Latin American countries as well. So thank you very much for your insight intervention. So now we will, if you like, have like a round of shorter, more concise interventions, but more dynamic and fruitful, so that we can start the discussion per se. Anyone who wants to jump in?
I can jump in. I would really like to expand on one of the points that Chris was making that has to do with the lack of continuity, because I saw my fellow panelists and myself, we all nodded very eagerly in agreement. And I think this is certainly a point that it's part of the trends that we see in organized crime. And I would add, yes, every administration comes in with their new plan. Everyone is trying to reinvent the wheel. And we don't see, unlike what happened in the region in the 80s, where economics became essentially a professional activity, right? And managing a central bank became the remit of technocrats. We have yet to see that happen in security, right? Where you actually have a core, of bureaucrats, and I use that word in the true sense, not in a derogatory sense, but of, public servants who are specialists in security and therefore work on that. I would add that certainly the challenge that we see in the region and certainly in Mexico are tied to these, let's reinvent the wheel, in the case of Mexico every 6 years, but certainly, other countries as well.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Cecilia, just to kind of come in and chip in to that. And I think speaking to Chris's point as well, I was one of the vigorous nodders sat here on the panel in relation to that. I can't speak for my European colleagues that Chris kind of cited, but I do think that it's we are conscious of, I guess, linked to Alex Duval's research of the kind of the political marketplace. What can we do as an external actor, and what harms could we generate when it is such a political, it is such a policy linked to a kind of personality, a political personality and a political individual. And I think that for many of us as kind of in the international donor community generates significant concern and caution. and I'm sure is ultimately quite damaging, because obviously now is the time to act and invest and to tackle these issues and to lean in. And so that freezing effect that Chris spoke about is something that I'm kind of not surprised by, and could definitely kind of resonate with elements of in my experience. I wanted to also touch on something that Chris said around this obsession with cocaine that is understandable and necessary, but also kind of ill-judged in how we go about it. So I think the evidence base points to the fact that if we, and correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, it goes without saying, but if we focus heavily on one type of threat and criminal typology, we often displace it either geographically or into another criminal typology. So thinking through these kind of what we call threat agnostic interventions that tackle drivers, enablers of serious organized crime, that think about kind of following the money approaches. These are some of the kind of hows and the kind of methodologies and the designs of how we might begin to tackle such issues. And I think that kind of never-ending focus and obsession on cocaine can result in quite damaging implications. The same goes for when we think about conflict and instability dynamics. One of the big things we consistently, one of the tropes we hear around Colombia is that, the Colombian conflict is all about cocaine, and that's, an absolute myth, and it's much more complicated than that. And if we start to think about crimes of convergence and typologies and illicit economies and markets rather than cocaine, I think we will be able to design better interventions and generate more traction on these issues. I will pause there.
I just want to, yes, may I? Okay, I just want to improve more on the data that I presented about the quantity of criminal groups that were dismantled in 1 decade here in Costa Rica, that I think that it reflects a dichotomy that we can say on about analyzing the dynamic of organized crime. From the one hand, as the work of police officers on dismantling these organized criminal groups, and on the other hand, is the capacity of these criminal organized groups to integrate and being dismantled again. I think that this is a way of that criticize and explain how the capacity and the power that they have to emerge through other sources. And also because the situation of Costa Rica is so alarming nowadays. But if we take a look at the security plan that was presented by the Ministry of Security the end of last year, and one of the main issues that were discussed is how to integrate all the capacities of policy forces in Costa Rica to counter organized crime. I say this because in Costa Rica, there is no military, but there are 11 different police forces, which are accountable to 5 ministers, municipal government, as well as the judiciary. So this is a way of how to mitigate the threat of organized crime in a fragmented way that the police officers operate. And also the point comes that we should reflect on the topic is we talk more about cooperation, information sharing, but how can we build trust in this partnership to have a better strategy to mitigate organized crime? I think that building trust is one element that comes in correlation with these policies to combat organized crime that must be reflected in our analysis.
I'd like to just piggyback off of Mauricio's last point about how do you build trust. When we go back to the point about the EU. The EU-Ecuador 2021 to 2028 roadmap contemplates significant billions of euros in investment, but they're not contemplating investments in prisons, which has been a catastrophic failure. INL, the US INL, has in fact stopped investing in Ecuador in prisons at all. They're just completely out because it's a waste of money. The Coast Guard, the EU had a program with the Ecuadorian Coast Guard until we found out that the Coast Guard essentially are drug traffickers and are part of the drug trafficking supply chain. So the EU is investing in SMEs. It's investing in electrification, especially at the Peru-Ecuador border. It's investing in indigenous communities and economic rights there. There's been a problem that ties back to organized crime. The belief was if you sidestep the prison systems and the coast guards, you can sidestep most of the corruption. Yes, to a certain point, because then you get into lower layers of corruption, because there's absolutely corruption in Latin American infrastructure and rural agriculture and indigenous rights. Absolutely. It's just less studied. So then you run into the roadblock of perhaps, in terms of money being involved, lesser quantities of corruption, but they're not understood at all. Whereas at the surface level, the security forces, the prisons, we know they're corrupt. Like there's ample evidence and evidence-based research on that, which doesn't exist at the lower level, which is where that trust is trying to be built in a lot of EU and other partners' investment programs in Latin America. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. Wherever you go, there's that criminal problem. It's just a different incarnation of
it. So correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, if I understood you correctly. Based on what you said, I mean, you're kind of highlighting the scope and limitations of the root causes paradigm. I mean, it's obviously important to focus on electrification or indigenous communities, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough to focus on that. Is that right?
What I'm saying is that that's a way of gaining trust, right? A way of gaining trust is to invest in the lesser observed areas that are creators of economic instability and poverty and joblessness, and that's where you gain trust, and that's where you also create alternatives for young people instead of a life of crime. And that's working, and that's been successful, especially in the Ecuadorian province of Chimborazo. But you still run into different incarnations of the same obstacles, which is a presence of organized crime and institutionalized corruption at every level of the state apparatus.
Okay, thanks. Cecilia, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly on that point, I think part of the challenge that we have and why we're stuck there is because our indicators for measuring success around organized crime, I would say, are very unsophisticated. And so if we look, for instance, at the US-Mexico border, the indicators that are used there are how many people you stop and how many drugs you seized. And if we're talking about a secure and smart border, which is a conversation that Mexico and the US have had now for over 20 years, those cannot be the indicators that we use. Like telling me how many people you stop and calling it events, and telling me how many drugs and firearms you seize, that cannot be the only measure that we have for understanding what constitutes safe and secure and potentially even smart, right? And so I think we really are at a point where we should be thinking about just better indicators of how do we measure this success, that have also to do precisely with the work that you do with other organizations that are not just law enforcement focused, right? And so, for instance, civil society organizations in San Diego that distribute naloxone, the medication that helps you revert an opiate overdose, also talk about how many lives you save, how many community outreach programs you had. And so I think we also need to start expanding the way that we measure what constitutes success in organized crime, that cannot just be law enforcement focused on how many arrests you have. And I think, to the extent that that's the only way we measure success, we'll be stuck in this, conversation around like, where do you invest, right? Where do you go?
Yes, because maybe a law enforcement success might not be a strategic success and a long-term result and political outcomes. So yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, I guess I can come in on that. I think the quantitative, qualitative indicator set, that's maybe not the most helpful binary, but the kind of indicator problem that Cecilia was talking about, I think, is really important. And I think when we design these interventions and we think about these kind of objectives, it's really trying to understand like what is our overarching objective and acknowledging when there is a political one. Unfortunately, I think lots of the governments of the day are trying to kind of pander to an electorate and therefore are very conscious of what are electoral successes. And I think, in the Latin American context, recently we've seen kind of a wave of mano dura kind of approaches to tackling serious organized crime that are currently really favored in the kind of electorate, as seen by the kind of, as Chris mentioned, the current popularity ratings of Novoa and others. So I think thinking these things through and kind of drilling down on what is a kind of evidence-based and emphasizing the importance of kind of that holistic approach. The UK speaks of kind of 4 Ps, which is kind of prevent, prepare, protect, pursue. And I think others will have kind of other versions of this. But again, it speaks to that kind of multidisciplinary approach that needs to happen in tandem to avoid, displacement, unintended consequences, kind of short-term thinking, etc., etc.
Yeah. Mauricio, Chris, something about these previous comments?
Actually, I would like to jump in on one question that Rafael Marreto just brought on the chat. I think that relates to one of the data that I presented. That is the question A: which core non-state armed groups and organized criminal groups have been mapped, identified, and which are still not spotlighted for some reasons as per these usually armed actors' modus operandi strategies? I think that in this identification process and naming them, I think that we know that the main criminal organized groups in different countries and in Brazil, PCC, Comando Vermelho, here in Costa Rica, Los Morreco. But I think then that when I presented the data, that the ICD, the Institute for Crimes and Drugs here in Costa Rica, just identified them into 3 categories: local, narco families, and international. So there was no need to put a name or identify them, but just the way that they were structured. And I think that here we have more opportunity to provide in-depth analysis on not only if they really have a name or if they are connected to those other main criminal groups that operate in the country. So I think that it's a way of improving our analysis on this, but naming, it's a way of how we understand and want them to improve our research. But for the Department of Police, for example, that was not necessary.
I'd like to intervene on another question that Rafael put in the chat, which is what seaports have been mapped out to the extent and to understand the way that their land, fluvial and other connections have contributed. The answer is actually several have been mapped out really well, and it doesn't make a difference. The Port of Antwerp and the Port of Rotterdam, for very different reasons, even though they're geographically quite close, are major ports of entry for cocaine. Antwerp is the size of a small city. The Port of Antwerp is bigger than the city where I live, which has 150,000 people. And the Port of Antwerp is bigger than this city. And it has, I think, 100 police inspectors just for the port. It's just very difficult to shift that much cocaine. And I think that's something that we haven't talked about. To what extent is international commerce, whether it's by sea, by land, by air, ever going to stop to let security measures catch up? And I think the answer is never. Never. And I think that's a question for politicians as well, right? We're asking private companies, we're asking ports, we're asking airports to collaborate together and share information on wildlife crime and contraband and drug trafficking when those entities are at their core competitors for ever more, ever faster, ever greater quantities of commerce. And the Port of Guayaquil is evidence of that, right? There was just a story I heard the other day. In January, just as Plan Felix was getting ramped up, a refrigerated container broke down in the port. 3 engineers from a company went to fix it, and inside the container they found 150 kilos of cocaine. Within 18 hours of that, all 3 were dead. All 3 refrigerated engineers were dead. They had no connection to the drug trade that we knew of. They happened to fall upon that quantity of drugs, but they're not taking any chances, right? Literally killing anybody who threatens their thing. I believe the container was held for 48 hours, and then it was gone. I don't know what was in it or why it was going, but that container was out of the port within 48 hours of a triple homicide connected to it. That is cold, hard cash talking, that is always going to be more important than security collaboration or slowing down to see what security lessons we can take from what's happening in a port.
Thanks, Chris. So basically, we can continue with this other questions our colleagues watching these seminaries have raised. So okay, seaports crisis. Then what about land and fluvial routes? But who are the legal and illegal actors validating these denominated seaports crisis? And I should follow with the D question. Public and private companies involved? That's a wonderful question, actually. Probably you will have some remarks to make. And at last, what are the best practices for making vulnerable communities within the then ports, regions, and neighborhoods more capable for resilience and not be coerced onto joining legal activities, plus also the civilians opting for an illegal rational choice scheme to support the NSAG and OCG operational within this region? Anyone who wants to answer this round of questions? Or question, a particular one?
Yeah, I can jump in on kind of community resilience building. I think that there are kind of several stages and kind of that are really integral to finding the right intervention. And I mean, I hate to be annoying, but the obvious thing is it depends on the context. So you need a really robust political economy analysis, really robust mapping analysis. And then, but, you know, if we're going to speak in kind of general terms, there are some things that we know are important. We know that trying to invest in kind of a range of different sectors and services so that local communities have an increasingly diverse set of touch points in relation to the state, which gives them that sense of the social contract, providing kind of psychosocial support, providing education for kids, that kind of thing, is really, really important. The problem is that it's really, really expensive. So we're trying to generate kind of second, particularly in the community resilience building, it's a lot around kind of investing in prevention. And we're trying to generate second generation changes, and they take time. So I think one of the things in my experience around designing and trying to deliver preventative approaches in kind of community settings, it's a lot around trying to let the kind of the community design and dictate and participate in the design of the services and the program that they need. So again, we know that community-led responses and community designed approaches tend to be some of the most innovative entrepreneurial responses to tackling serious organized crime and preventing them and kind of building that resilience. But a lot of it is trying to prevent individuals from becoming recruited into organized criminal groups that are providing that kind of criminal governance structures that we spoke about earlier. So yeah, I think it takes a lot of investment. I think it takes community participation. I think it takes time, and that's probably quite a frustrating answer because those three components are not an easy trinity of things, but I think those are some of the key ingredients that we need.
I just would add quickly to that point, and this is something that I don't think we should underestimate, because oftentimes when we're looking, for instance, at alternative development projects, right, there's a question of, well, you will never compete with the prices that are offered in illicit economies. But I think there's something to be said around not having to experience this constant threat of violence that you do experience when you participate in illicit economy, particularly in the most vulnerable links in the chain. And so I think, you know, when I have spoken with people who were previously involved in, you know, growing illicit crops, even though participating in illicit economy sometimes is more work than the illicit one, there is a value that is placed in not having that constant threat of violence. And I think, again, you know, to Victoria's point, this is something that takes time to build, and is not something overnight, and is something that the state can just desire and then it will be produced. But I think, again, you know, certainly there is, I'm not saying that there isn't an economic calculation there, but there's also about this threat of violence that we should think around, you know, when we think about the community level, that matters, you know, for making certain decisions of participating in illicit economies. And I think to the extent that you can also offer that alternative, you know, again, precisely also because the state is not victimizing you as it often does, especially in drug producing regions. there's also something that we should consider in this analysis.
I'd like to just make a statement in reference to what Victoria was just saying. I actually interviewed Maurício on this topic a year ago, which is the issue of child recruitment in urban environments, where, and I think Maurício was researching this with Megan Kapp, an excellent book published last year by the UPeace, on essentially when children are exposed to organized crime at a young age, when they actually take the step to becoming active participants, willing or unwilling, in organized crime structures, it's not even seen as a big deal. It's seen as just a normal progress. The problem with that is that if you look at, and I'm taking two examples, Duran outside Guayaquil and Rio, certain parts of Rio, where the level of criminal governance, and this is a point that Victoria made in her first intervention, the level of criminal governance is so absolute that it has become model for other OCGs to copy in other parts of Latin America. I don't know to what extent the CJNG is in touch with the PCC or the Red Command, but the model in which Brazil militias, for example, run every public service in areas of the city, build condos, build apartment buildings off the books and rent them out as legitimate businesses, control car parking spaces, control internet access, control trash collection, and extort every single player in that sphere, is now being seen in parts of Mexico. Not to the same extent, and it's in cities where the situation in Mexico is quite dire, like Acapulco, Tijuana. But it's a model that is being standardized. In Duran, it's not even difficult. Duran, Stephen Dudley, I was on a panel with him yesterday, the founder of Inside Crime. He said he was in Duran recently. He said it reminds him of Haiti, where 70% of people don't have running water, where a high percentage, I forget the exact percentage, but more than half don't have electricity. The level of community building and investment needed is absolutely astronomical when you're talking about a city of, I believe, 250,000 people, which is a major flow for drugs going into Guayaquil and therefore into Europe. So the scale of the intervention is just colossal in urban environments.
I just want to jump in on the question about that Michelle just brought on the chat, but in parentheses, the chapter, the publication that you mentioned, Chris, it is a chapter that was written by Megan Kapp on the situation of children of incarcerated parents. So I can put the link of this publication here at the chat in a few minutes. But
I warmly recommend reading that. It was excellent.
Yes, and the question that Michelle just raised in the chat is about how can we apply a security strategy? I think that first of all, and I want to jump in on what Victoria said about the necessity and the need for conflict mapping and sensitivity. I think that you must understand well the situation in a sense to understand what is not going well, what is not working. And Michelle just wrote the word very weak government and institutions. And I think that this idea of fragility, institutional fragility, state fragility, but in a sense that this is a country that is not failed, but just to identify what is failing in the functioning of the country, what is the dysfunctionality, because we have the different dimensions of fragility that we can apply in a strategy, in a sense to identify what is not working well, such as politics, economics, humanitarian, social, and environmental. So these are a more complex and holistic view to understand how first you have to design a strategy before applying it.
Yeah, there are more questions on the chat. And if you have more, please feel free to type them and express them. Okay, there is one from Tom Konsak. Thank you all for sharing your valuable insights, much appreciated. When talking about combating organized crime, so far more holistic, whole society approaches haven't been touched upon a lot. Southern Spain is a sad example of extended drug and human trafficking in the context of high unemployment rates and low opportunity costs. What is being done to respond more sustainably to these challenges? And there is also, in order to make this more dynamic, there is one for Chris from Michelle. Why with the Estados de Excepción in Ecuador did lower the homicide rates in Ecuador, but in Duran, it is still the same with a homicide rate of 145 per 100,000 inhabitants.
I've been talking a lot recently, so I'm happy to let someone else take the floor here.
Yeah, and about Tom Konzak's question, anyone? Also, Markela Lentidaki, a general question: with differences, if any, have you noticed in the recruitment in organized crime based on gender in Latin America, especially in narco families? Have you seen any change, related to gender that should concern policymakers?
So I can jump in on this last one, on the gender one, and on this I have written something that I call the paradox of invisibility, right? Essentially, where criminal groups know that law enforcement and the media, to some extent, don't really pay attention to women, and often tend to think only of women participating in criminal groups as a result of family ties or romantic ties, right? Not necessarily having a lot of agency in participating. And I think, some of it, has been evident when it comes to money laundering, for instance, where you do take advantage of certain social capital that certain people have, to conduct money laundering. But I would say that we are, again, our research is very behind in understanding different gender roles, and it's not only about how women participate in organized crime, but also how not all men benefit equally from participating in criminal groups, right? So, there's obviously a focus on kingpins in the media, but, when we talk about recruitment, for instance, you have all these lower levels that are not necessarily benefiting from their participation in illicit economies in the same manner. And I think that's something that we should really be paying attention to. And again, I think one of the things that deserves more attention is these functions that are non-violent. And I understand, of course, the limitation in terms of resources. And if you, have limited time and funding, you may want to perhaps focus on those activities that are damaging the population as a whole the most, and these tend to be violent functions. But again, the non-violent functions that sustain organized crime also play a crucial role in allowing these activities to happen. And so I think, when it comes to gender, is not only understanding how women participate, but also understanding as a whole the different, levels of benefits that different groups get from participating in these illicit economies. And again, I think the other data point that we need is understanding the composition of our criminal justice systems. And I wouldn't, minimize that, because it also affects the way that investigations are conducted. So, a lot to do in that area, but I think there's some promise as to how to do it.
Yeah, just to...
sorry, Victor, just wanted to ask Dr. Farfan, where can we read about this paradox of invisibility? If you could share any material, would be wonderful.
Yeah, of course. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat. Thank you for that.
I was gonna just very briefly add, I think I completely agree with what Cecilia just spoke about. And I would also add the social norms and the cultural component, and the need to really consider how these impact kind of gender in kind of organized criminal group recruitment and kind of the running of their business. And I think trying to move away from, the victim, kind of the dominant discourse about women as victims, and trying instead to think through, the kind of social and gender norms that impact the different functions of men and women in organized criminal groups will be really important. And I think Cecilia touched on this, but moving away from when we talk about gender, it just meaning women, the concept of masculinities is kind of absolutely critical to organized criminal groups and how they function, and why the kind of typologies of violence kind of are born in the way that they are. I can see we have a hand up, so I will pause there and let colleagues come in with questions.
Well, Markela Lentidaki raised her hand. Now it appears she didn't. Anyway, if you want to raise the question, Marcela.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your answers, because when I met many organizations in Mexico with my criminology department, no one answered about the gender aspect in policy making, in research. All of the professors in Mexico City and Guadalajara, and they completely skip the questions on genders. So thank you very much, really.
Well, Marcela, Dr. Cecilia has shared some documents and information, so I'm sure it will be helpful for you and your endeavors. Okay, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to cycle back a bit to that question about why the murder rate went down in Ecuador but stayed high in Duran. The murder rate went down initially. I'm interested to see where it goes in the long term. Duran is a very, very difficult nut to crack. In a legacy from the Correa era, the Latin kings are in that city, and they have because they were legalized in 2012 under the initiative by Rafael Correa. They have very well established governance in Duran, which, as has been challenged by the Chone killers, which are one of the new generation of gangs in Duran, that has led to a lot of conflict, not just for drug trafficking routes and cocaine, but also for control of extortion and kidnapping and the type of criminal governance that we were talking about earlier, which is control of public services. The gangs in Duran even control water, the water trucks that roll into the city. In the rest of Ecuador, similarly, and I'm very hesitant to compare Ecuador to El Salvador. This is the only comparison that I will make. Initially, there was a shock factor. Obviously, if you flood the streets with military and you flood the prisons with military, you are going to see a temporary drop in homicides, which is what President Nabar wanted to do. What I think everybody's asking is what's next, right? How do you justify that? How do you keep that going in a country that is 17 times the size of El Salvador? And El Salvador, to do it in a much smaller space, has jailed hundreds of thousands of people with limited due process and sacrificed significant human rights for security. And I'm very aware that the argument for that is quite strong on both sides. In Ecuador, you can't apply bucalismo. You can't apply mano dura. It's too big. It's too complicated. The criminal gangs are not as united and not as centralized as the gangs were in El Salvador, and Noboa does not have the legacy that Bukele has at this point. So I think you're going to continue to see that in Ecuador. You're going to see pockets of improvement when he actually throws money and resources at the problem. And then you'll see nuggets of continued violence because that city or that area is just too complicated to resolve in the short term.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's time to, well, according to the agenda, and in order not to abuse of your time, it's time to come to a close. And I want to thank again to the speakers for the remarkable participation. We will definitely carry on this conversation, whether in virtual or in-presence panels. But for now, perhaps it's more useful to generate more questions than answers to better understand the dynamics and trends of organized crime in Latin America and perhaps elsewhere, and to find patterns. Anyway, also thanks to those who attended this online seminar. For those interested in following the other online seminars, please stay tuned for the next activities on the Standing Group on Organized Crime Twitter account, well, now X, and we hope to see you again. And depending on your country, good night and good luck.